There are moments in life that split you in two, the person you were before and the person you become after. For a man named Richard Calloway, that moment came on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Not at the altar this time, but in a garden behind the house he had shared with his wife for exactly 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. He had counted, not because he was happy, but because he was still trying to convince himself that what he felt was not real, that it was inconvenient, that it was not love. He had been wrong about a lot of things in his life, but he was beginning to understand that this quiet, steady, unbothered woman named Joanna was the thing he had been most wrong about. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. You remember where we left off. Richard standing in that garden. Joanna's hands in the dirt. A letter sealed in red wax sitting on the kitchen table behind him, unopened, sent from Spain. And Richard choosing, for the very first time in his adult life, to let something wait. Because the woman in front of him mattered more than whatever was in that envelope. That was 4 months ago. And what happened between that morning and the night the letter finally changed everything. That is the story no one tells. Because people love the grand gesture, the dramatic turn, the movie moment. What they do not talk about is the slow, quiet, terrifying process of a man learning to stop running from the one person who never once asked him to stay. Richard Calloway grew up watching his father love his mother the way you love something you're afraid of losing, loudly, desperately, in bursts. When his father died, his mother did not grieve the way Richard expected. She grieved quietly, steadily. And one night, when Richard was 19 years old, she told him something he never forgot. She said, "Your father loved me the way a storm loves the shore, but I needed someone who loved me the way the tide does. Consistent, always returning, without drama." Richard had not understood that then. He was 19. He thought love was supposed to feel like a storm. He spent the next 15 years chasing exactly that and getting destroyed every time it passed. So by the time the arrangement with Joanna's father was placed on the table, a business deal dressed in wedding vows, Richard told himself it was a relief. No storms, no feeling, no risk. He was 37 years old. His family estate was carrying debt that would have embarrassed 3 generations before him, and the Whitfield family had money, connections, and one unmarried daughter who, according to everyone, was quiet and agreeable and asked for very little. What Richard did not know, what nobody bothered to tell him, was that Joanna Whitfield was quiet the way a river is quiet. Not empty, just deep and moving and going somewhere entirely on its own terms. The first week of their marriage, they barely spoke. Richard worked from his study from 7 in the morning until after dark. Joanna arranged the kitchen, reorganized the library, and spent 2 hours every afternoon in the garden with her hands in the soil and her eyes on the sky. Richard noticed. He told himself he did not care. He was lying. By the second week, he started leaving his study door open. Not all the way, just enough. Enough to hear her. The sound of pages turning. The occasional soft hum she did when she was concentrating. Once, just once, he heard her laugh at something she was reading, and the sound of it stopped him mid-sentence in a letter he was writing. He sat there for 11 seconds. He counted those too. By the third week, he found himself doing something that genuinely alarmed him. He started timing his walk to the kitchen around her afternoon garden hours. Not to talk to her, just to pass the window, just to see her there, hands in dirt, hair slightly loose, absolutely unaware that she was dismantling something in him that he had spent years building. And then one evening, he made a mistake. He walked into the kitchen, and she was already there, sitting at the table with a glass of water and a book, and she looked up at him and said, simply, "There's soup on the stove if you haven't eaten." He had not eaten. He sat down. She went back to her book. They did not speak for 40 minutes, and it was the most comfortable Richard had felt in 15 years. That terrified him more than anything else. Ask yourself something. Have you ever been so afraid of being happy that you almost talked yourself out of it? Have you ever stood right at the edge of something good and looked for every reason to step back? Because that is exactly where Richard lived for those first 4 months. He would notice something about Joanna, the way she never raised her voice, the way she answered hard questions directly and without cruelty, the way she once sat with their elderly housekeeper for an hour when the woman was upset about something small. And instead of letting it move him, he would file it away like evidence in a case he was building against himself, as if feeling something for this woman was a weakness he needed to prosecute. Meanwhile, Joanna asked for nothing. She did not push. She did not perform for him. She simply lived, fully, quietly, in her own way, right next to a man who was slowly falling apart in the most beautiful way possible. The garden confession happened on a Wednesday. Richard had not planned it. He had not rehearsed it. He came out to tell her that a fence on the east side of the property needed repair. That was the entire reason. And then he saw her, mud on her cheek, that loose strand of hair across her forehead, laughing softly at a bird that had landed 2 feet from her and refused to move. And something in him gave out. Not broke, gave out, like a muscle that had been clenched for so long that it finally released. He walked over. He crouched beside her, and he said the truest thing he had said in 15 years. He said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him, not surprised, not hopeful, just present. And she said, "For what specifically?" And he said, "For deciding who you were before I ever gave you the chance to show me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know, not to be cruel, just because it was true." And she knew it. And she had decided, long before that morning, that she was going to let him get there on his own, because that was the only way it would mean anything. He touched the scar then, the one along her jaw that she had never once hidden or explained. He had noticed it on their wedding day. He had told himself it did not matter. What he meant was that he was afraid to ask, because asking meant caring, and caring meant risk. He touched it gently, and she did not flinch, and he said, "Can I ask?" And she said, "Car accident. I was 16. My mom didn't make it." And in that sentence, 9 words, Richard understood everything about Joanna Whitfield that he had been too closed off to see for 4 months. She had been carrying grief her entire adult life with the same quiet steadiness she brought to everything else. And she had never once asked him to carry it with her. She had simply carried it, right next to him, without complaint. He stayed in that garden until the sun went down. They talked, really talked for the first time, about his father, about her mother, about the versions of themselves they had built to survive their losses, about how exhausting it was to pretend that nothing could reach you. At some point, she said something that has stayed with the people who know this story ever since. She said, "I didn't marry you hoping you would love me, Richard. I married you hoping you would eventually let yourself. And if you're watching this and you have ever closed yourself off from someone who was good for you, someone patient, someone steady, someone who simply waited, then you already know what that sentence feels like in your chest." Now, the letter from Spain, the one sealed in red wax, the one Richard had left sitting on that kitchen table for 4 months without opening. On the night he finally opened it, everything they had quietly built together was placed directly in its path. And what was inside, it was not what either of them expected, because the sender was not a stranger. And the secret it carried had been kept for over a decade. And once Richard read it, once Joanna read it over his shoulder, her hand resting on his arm, neither of them spoke for a very long time. Because some truths, when they finally arrive, do not arrive gently. What do you think was in that letter? And honestly, if you had been in Joanna's place, waiting patiently for a man who refused to see you, would you have stayed? Tell us in the comments. Because the next part of this story is the one that changes everything. And you do not want to miss it. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next.